Welcome to B-Sides Live, a podcast for music lovers by music lovers. My name is Dan Baxter, and on this episode, I'm going to be joined by my friend Benjy Schoenfeld, otherwise known in the vinyl community as Vinyl Benjy. He's going to take us through the kind of chaotic but fruitful relationship between the Beach Boys and the Beatles in the mid to late 60s. These are his two favorite bands of all time, so I kind of knew he would have a tremendous amount of knowledge about this period, and he did not disappoint. I learned a lot. I hope you will too. I just want to say we record these live on Zoom, so keep your eyes on the calendar page linked in the description below to see if you can make it to the next one. Otherwise, subscribe if you'd like. We'd love to have you, but I hope you enjoy the episode. So happy to see all of you here. Some new faces. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to see you. Tonight, our show is the Beach Boys versus the Beatles. And while we say versus, it's really more of a ping pong match because these bands really kind of inspired and influenced each other to make greater and greater and greater music. And we are all still to this day reaping the benefits. So tonight, my guest and I are going to be kind of talking through the period roughly through 1964 to 1968, 69. But there is no person I think could better fit the bill to talk through this tonight, other than Benjy Schoenfeld, Vinyl Benjy. He's big in the vinyl community here on Instagram, on TikTok, and he is just super knowledgeable about both of these bands because they are his two favorite bands. So I wanted to quickly share a quick TikTok from Benjy. So let's just kind of kick off the night with this.
I'm sorry, this has to be addressed. How did this become this, become this, become this?
So welcome, Vinyl Benjy. Thanks for joining, man.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I'm so excited to be here.
Of course, dude. It's good to see you. So like I said, these are your two favorite bands of all time. Is that correct?
Yeah, these are my two big favorite bands. They've been my two favorites my whole life, and my parents, got me into it in the first place. It's hard, I can't not make them my favorite anymore. You know what I mean? It's like they're just in my blood.
I feel you. If you listen to it that long, it has to be a part of your blood, man.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that TikTok, that's pretty much the story in the nutshell. So go home. Goodbye, everybody.
And like a lot of people here, I think that's kind of as much as I knew. Like I knew like these albums kind of influenced each other somehow. I wasn't sure what like the exact points would be, but I do know that between all of the music that both of these bands put out at the time, there's so many songs that we could have picked, but Benjy has really kind of honed in and picked the very specific songs to what was going on at this time. So
the Beatles and the Beach Boys really took America by storm. There was a time in the early 60s where people thought rock and roll was dead. Before that, Elvis went to the army. Little Richard became a minister and quit popular music, and Buddy Holly died in a plane crash. And people really literally thought rock and roll
a literal end.
And it didn't help that also and when the Beatles and the Beach Boys both became big, that was also right after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So the country was in a sad state for sure. But then the Beatles took over America, and the Beach Boys became popular themselves as well. And really, they took our country by storm and the world by storm.
And again, they've made such an impact that we're still talking about them to this day.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wanted to see, do you think you could maybe, this is kind of a weird question, but do you think you could explain who these bands are to someone who may not know who they are?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to explain. They've done so much. How can I narrow it down? But let me try my best. The Beatles are a band from Liverpool, England. That's where they were formed. In the late 1950s, John Lennon had a band called the Quarrymen, and eventually he added Paul to that, and then George to that, and they kind of became the Beatles. And in 1962, Ringo became their drummer. And they had they were really influenced by, of course, rock and roll, but they had lots of influences, country and jazz and R&B and all these other genres really impacted their music. And so that's just that's an early story. I don't know how to, it's so hard to explain. They're just one of the greatest bands of all time. You know, they did what was popular, but they also little by little did influential and interesting things and broke lots of ground.
I couldn't agree more. Well, let's get to know them through their music and hear a couple of singles by them. Little early Beatles action. I just absolutely love those songs.
Oh, they're so amazing. You know, Love Me Do was their first major single, and She Loves You was one of their earlier singles that really started to bring them up. You know, um, they're just they're still two of my favorite songs, and the original UK pressings of the Love Me Do single are incredibly rare, and I somehow have two of them. That's a story for another day.
Hey, how about that? Yeah. So then another band around the same time is kind of on the scene. You want to kind of talk about them?
Yeah, so the Beach Boys started in the early 60s, 1960. Well, in a way, they were sort of always together. So, unlike the Beatles, the Beach Boys, they were a family. Brian Wilson, his brothers Carl and Dennis, their cousin Mike Love, and Al Jardine, their friend. They did their first session in 1962, and eventually, through the help of the Wilsons' father Murray, they he quickly got them signed to Capitol, and they quickly became a pretty popular group.
And let's hear a couple tracks from them around this time.
Yeah.
So there's no wonder both bands kind of had pretty intense commercial success. They just had amazing tunes.
Oh, an amazing talent. You know, it's amazing. So, as before, Surfing Safari was their first major single. And Surfer Girl was a later one that sort of showed. But here's the thing: Surfer Girl was actually the first song Brian Wilson ever wrote.
A Surfer Girl was.
Surfer Girl was one of the first songs he ever wrote.
Oh, very interesting. I did
And
not
these
know
are the
that.
major label versions. But if you want to hear early versions of the songs, they did versions of these songs on their Candix sessions. You know, their pre Capitol sessions. And there's a compilation out on Spotify and everything. The Morgan sessions. I forgot the name of it. It's a very long name, so I forgot the top of my head.
Sure, yeah.
But
No
they did
worries.
early versions of these songs too. They're online. They're fun to listen to. I definitely recommend them.
All right, we'll have to check them out.
Yeah.
Um, like I said, they both had huge commercial success. They both had huge chart topping hits.
Yeah.
I think you picked a couple that you wanted to play. Anything you want to say about those?
Yeah, I will. So the next two songs we're going to play are they're both groups their first number one hits here in America. Um, you know, obviously the Beatles ended up having lots of amazing hits, as you can see right there. I even to this day, I don't think that there have been any groups or artists that have had the top 5 spots on the charts. I don't think I think it's hasn't been beaten. But their first number one here in America was "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and the Beach Boys' first number one hit here in America was "I Get Around." Both
So
amazing songs.
let's just dive into those. And these are, both huge bands kind of hitting the same audience around the same time. So kind of think about that as you listen to these two. Again, both hitting kind of the same groups or same audience at the same time, but very, very great and both super unique songs and sounds.
You know, and yeah, the Beatles and the Beach Boys both had unique sounds. You know, they really, as I mentioned before, the Beatles had a wide range of influences and really used all them to craft their sound and make amazing music. And Brian Wilson, who's pretty much at this point, you know, the main man of the Beach Boys, he took two of his biggest influences to craft their sound. For the Beach Boys, it was the Four Freshmen who inspired all the harmonies, the beautiful, beautiful harmonies, and it was rock and roll like Chuck Berry in particular. So he combined those two and made all that unique sound for them. Such a unique sound both groups had.
And something interesting that kind of starts to happen is once the Beatles kind of come over to America, they hear American music on the radio for the first time, and they start kind of taking that in as another influence and starts developing their sound even more.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the Beatles were always into American music, but but yeah, they definitely continue listening to it, of course, as they there's actually a special that I once watched years ago. It was about this portable jukebox that John Lennon had, and it had all these interesting songs. They were mostly American, and they all had different genres and stuff. And they talk about each song, and the artists of the songs came and talk about them, and they were in John's jukebox. Oh yeah, but I'm getting carried away right now. Yeah, Rubber Soul. So this is really the beginning of the Beatles and the Beach Boys, creative rivalry, if that's the right way to call it. And I think the best way to sort of start talking about it is I'm just going to read a direct quote from Brian Wilson himself. And before I sort of go into it, the Rubber Soul that most of us think of is the British Rubber Soul, which was, in the 80s when the Beatles catalog was issued on CD for the first time. They issued the British albums, and so that's the Rubber Soul that we all know. That's this one, and it has the orange logo right here. But the Rubber Soul that he listened to and really got into was the American Rubber Soul, which has some track differences, and I'll just talk about those in a second. Notice that the logo here is a bit gold. Yes, there we are. Now, the Rubber Soul that we got here in America, and of course, influenced Brian Wilson. There were 4 songs that weren't on it. Drive My Car, Nowhere Ma'am, What Goes On, and If I Needed Someone were not on this Rubber Soul. But 2 songs from Help were on this Rubber Soul. I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love. I'm just going to quickly read the quote from Brian Wilson. But the one that really got me was Rubber Soul, which came out at the end of 1965. Rubber Soul is probably the greatest record ever. It came out in December 1965 and sent me right to the piano bench. It's a whole album of Beatles folk songs, a whole album where everything flows together and everything works. I remember being blown away by You Won't See Me and I'm Looking Through You and Girl. It wasn't just the lyrics and the melodies, but the production and their harmonies. They had such unique harmonies, In You Won't See Me, Paul sings low and George and John sing high. There's an organ drone in there and a note that's held down for the last third of the song or so. Those were touches they were trying, almost art music. What was so great about the Beatles was you could hear their ideas so clearly in their music. They didn't pose like some other bands, and they didn't try to stuff too much meaning in their songs. They might be singing a song about loneliness, or a song about anger, or a song about feeling down. They were great poets about simple things, but that also made it easier to hear the song. And they never did anything clumsy. It was like perfect pitch, but for entire songs. Everything landed on its feet. That's a quote from Brian Wilson's autobiography that came out a few years ago. Wow. And there's one more quick thing I will say. Some of those bands in their early years, they have a bunch of good songs, but then they might record some filler tracks. The Beach Boys in particular had interesting filler tracks. Like some were just comedy-ish. It's really interesting. But one of the things that Brian Wilson really loved about this album too was that there was no filler on it. Each song was amazing, and that really inspired him to create an album of songs that were amazing from start to finish.
All right, well, let's listen to a few choice selections from the U.S. version of Rubber Soul. Yeah, as Josh kind of just touched on in the chat, Rubber Soul really was such a unique thing at the time. It was such a unique sound and an absolute game changer.
It really is, and the American versions of albums weren't always well received. At least today, they're not always well received, but in case of Rubber Soul, both the British version and the American version both have a lot to offer. And I think the American version of Rubber Soul really was a folk rock masterpiece. It really inspired the sort of folk rock thing that was much more popular here in America.
And that's kind of what I was trying to touch on earlier. I think when they were doing For Sale, and then especially with this, they had been touring and they heard American country music specifically. So, it was some of the first times they were exposed to, Bob Dylan and stuff. And so that made a clear influence on them, I think, at the time.
And Ringo himself was always a big country star, a country fan.
Absolutely.
He later even did a country album after the Beatles broke up, but they even did on Help. They did a cover of Act Naturally. Yeah. So country was always sort of there too for them. Like with all the other genres they listen to. They listen to an eclectic mix of kinds of music and genres. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, so what do you think's happening in Brian Wilson's head at this point?
Well, he's getting ready to start making the greatest album ever. Like he really wanted to make an album that was great from start to finish. And so he'd already been starting to up his music game with the two albums before it were Beach Boys Today and Summer Days and Summer Nights, albums that are known for their incredible musical arrangements. Beach Boys Today had a lot more bittersweet, sadder, more personal songs. But Summer Days and Summer Nights, they wanted Capitol wanted Brian Wilson to make more summer songs and more sort of more similar to what the Beach Boys used to do, which he did.
Like beach, sun, summer,
Yeah.
surfing.
Right, but what he did this time was the arrangements and the arrangements of the songs themselves were still intricate and amazing. So he kind of took the best of both worlds for that album. And now we're getting to Pet Sounds, the album that became Pet Sounds. The first song that was recorded for Pet Sounds was Sloop John B. Now, Sloop John B was a song that Al Jardine had introduced to Brian. Al Jardine, growing up, was a very huge folk fan, and so he introduced it to Brian. That's Al, and here's here's me and Al. Yes, I have met him. Really cool.
Excellent, dude.
So yeah, he introduced Brian to that song, and Brian took a simple folk song that was that was done by the Kingston Trio, and turned it into this gave it this unique and beautiful and complex, amazing arrangement and vocals and in background. But Pet Sounds, by December of 1965, Pet Sounds wasn't finished. It wasn't ready. So the Beach Boys took a pause on creating Pet Sounds and created Party, an album that was recorded at a live party. It wasn't totally done that way. It was still carefully recorded. They did the acoustic. It was acoustic and them singing, and then they did eventually add party noises. But even that album still influenced a lot of people. I say it was the first of its kind. So yeah, Sloop John B was the first song recorded for Pet Sounds. And here's the thing with Party 2. They didn't write any new original songs. They're all covers. And they did 3 Beatles songs on Beach Boys Party. And I think we're going to hear them. We're going to do 2 studio versions and 1 live version that they did as well. So they love the Beatles love the Beach Boys, and they did some Beatles covers, and let's just play them. They're really great.
So thank you for that, Benji. That was completely new to me. I had never heard that before. But Dennis Wilson, it's amazing.
Yeah, he does it well on the album. He did it well live too. It's really they did it on Beach Boys Party, but of course I had to put the live version, and I really like that one. So I think it's time. We're about to get into Pet Sounds itself. Obviously, we already did Sloop John B. And we're going to have a touch of Revolver too. At this point, Pet Sounds had come out in late 1966. I think the Beatles had already heard it. The legend, there is a legend. I think this happened. Bruce Johnson actually went to the UK and was able to play Pet Sounds before it came out for John and Paul, and it really, really influenced them. And in fact, I'm actually going to read, I do have Paul McCartney's new book in front of me, the lyrics. And one of the songs from Revolver that was influenced by Pet Sounds is Here, There, and Everywhere. Let me just read a quick snippet from the book. In terms of circularity, though, it's hard to beat the fact that Here, There, and Everywhere was influenced most immediately by the Beach Boys' God Only Knows from Pet Sounds. What's really interesting is that God Only Knows was itself inspired by Brian Wilson's repeated listening to our songs on Rubber Soul. So by this point, the Beatles definitely were inspired by Pet Sounds. God Only Knows, of course, what is there to say about that song? We'll get to that song soon too, but God Only Knows how does the right way to say it? Paul McCartney has referred to God Only Knows as one of his all-time favorite songs. So
big statement coming from him.
Enough said, right?
All right, we'll get to that, but we're gonna kind of play through this area, this whole section. It's gonna kind of touch on a couple albums here.
We'll get a couple of Revolver, and then we're gonna have a bunch of Pet Sounds. So hope you all enjoy it. I'm gonna enjoy it.
I'm gonna enjoy it. hope you guys do too.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for sticking around. Let us know if you have any questions that we might be able to answer, but otherwise we'll just keep on spinning here. Lovely little group of tunes there, Benji. Thanks again for your picks.
Thank you for letting me pick them.
Anytime.
Also, let me just start with a quick quote from the legendary producer George Martin. Without Pet Sounds, Sgt. Pepper's wouldn't have been made. Pepper's was an attempt to equal Pet Sounds. And you can hear how Pet Sounds really changed the game and influenced them. When Pet Sounds came out, it did well, but not well enough. And it didn't top the charts in the same way other Beach Boys albums had. So when it came, the next album that they were making was called Smile. Unlike Pet Sounds, there it is. Unlike Pet Sounds, the Pet Sounds theme was all about like heartbreak and loss, and it's a little emotional. Smile, the whole idea of Smile was sort of this trip across the country. The lyrics are fascinating, to say the least. You know, sometimes I don't even understand them. This Brian Wilson, songwriter for this album, is a guy called Van Dyke Parks. And the lyrics are just so interesting. Like, you know, I'm a huge Beach Boys fan, but sometimes I can't understand what Surf's Up means. here's Smile. But I'm sure, as most of you know, this album was not made easily. There was some objection from other Beach Boys members. Mike Love in particular was into the formula, and there was some hard times making this album. And when Strawberry Fields Forever came out as a single, that pretty much ended the production of Smile. It was pretty much abandoned. Smile was pretty much canceled and abandoned once Strawberry Fields Forever came out, and they had to move on to making another album called Smiley Smile. We will get to that album eventually.
He was a bit defeated.
He was definitely defeated. But there is a song on this album, and it was eventually released on Smile Smile as well, but called Vegetables. It's a really fun song, and Paul McCartney himself does make an appearance. I have a couple of quotes, actually. Should I read Al Jardine's quote or Paul McCartney?
Absolutely. How about both?
Sure. Al Jardine. The night before a big tour, I was out in the studio recording the vocal for Vegetables when, to my surprise, Paul McCartney walked in and joined Brian at the console. And briefly, the two most influential musical Geminis in the world had a chance to work together. I remember waiting for long periods of time between takes to get to the next section or verse. Brian lost track of the session. Paul would come on the talkback and say something like, "Good take, Al." That was Al's quote. Now here's Brian's quote. And this is where you'll find out how how Paul contributes to the song. I just went round to the studio because they invited me. I just thought it would be fun to sit there and watch them record because I'm a big fan. And so I was there. And then it was, I think, Brian who came over and said, "Oh, Paul, got a favor to ask. Would you mind recording something?" I thought, "Oh no, but great, I could do that. Oh God, I'm going to be singing on a Beach Boys record or something, you know?" I got a bit kind of intimidated and thought, okay, here goes nothing. And they said, "Well, what we want you to do is go in there and just munch." Well, I can do that. So if you hear someone munching celery, that's me. End quote. So yeah, Paul McCartney supposedly munched some celery on Vegetables.
That's amazing. Keep your ears open for that when the track comes up. But we're just gonna play through some of these songs and do another block here. So let us know if you have any other questions. An absolute stunner. There's no escaping it.
Literally one of the greatest of all time. I mean, that's what I would say about all these songs, honestly. So I'm biased. So as I mentioned before, Brian had attempted to make Smile, but for a lot of reasons, and including, of course, that Sgt. Pepper had come out and that kind of sort of defeated Brian mentally, and Smile was canceled. And so they started fresh with another album called Smiley Smile. Let's just sort of, here's Smile. Smile did eventually come out only about 40 years later. This is Smile. And this is Smiley Smile. It's backwards. Hold on one second. Smiley Smile. Now, the big difference between them is Smile, like Pet Sounds, had these songs with these amazing, intricate arrangements, really, really intricate, beautiful arrangements. And Smiley Smile had great songs too, but it was really bare, like recorded at Brian Wilson's house, organ, like instruments from the house, like really, really bare bones. Um, and they did have some songs from those Smile sessions in there. Some of them were the originals, like Heroes and Villains. And there's a song called Wonderful that was recorded for Smile, and they re-recorded it for Smiley Smile. And there were other songs that were newly written for Smiley Smile, including again Hungry.
Something interesting I wanted to kind of point out about this is that this is really their kind of commercial follow up to Sergeant Pepper. Because they kind of canceled the other thing, they kind of scrapped together what they could and put together, Smiley Smile. It's really interesting to kind of a really like subtle comparison that I've always found super interesting is the opening to both sides of each album. So the opening of Sergeant Pepper on the A side is Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And on the B side, I think it's Within You, Without You. And both songs kind of have like this lead up, kind of they fade in before the song really kicks into gear. But on Smiley Smile, it's the exact opposite. On the A side, you have Heroes and Villains, which immediately starts the song. Like all instruments and vocals are pretty much within the first two notes of the song. And then on the B side, you have Good Vibrations, which also immediately just starts. So you have no fanfare. You have no lead up to what the project's going to be. It's just like, here we are. We're the Beach Boys. We're going to be a little weird,
It's funny. I never thought about that. I never noticed that. It kind of blew my mind a little bit.
It's very apparent on Heroes and Villains, especially.
Oh,
I think
yeah, it really
kind
is.
of the opening to the album. The first track they have to finally say something to Sergeant Pepper.
Yeah. And this album, this was sort of done very quickly and it came out. Carl Wilson famously called Smiley Smile a bunt instead of a grand slam. But I think that this album was influential too. It has its fans even to this
Absolutely.
day. This
The
album
interesting
also
thing
created something new, you know?
exactly, and the interesting thing about these two bands at this time were that they just like they made music weirder for each other so that people could get more used to weirder sounds, and they just kind of like kept pushing it a little forward and a little forward, like each of them. So it's this is just like the next kind of wacky step for them.
Yeah, wacky's an understatement, I suppose.
All right, well, let's listen to some of Smiley Smile.
Let's do it.
I've been in this town so long that
I really think, I hate to say it, but I think that this release might be my favorite Beach Boys release.
It's definitely one of my favorites too. And I think the reception for it has gotten better over the years because, like I said, even with this album, which was sort of a quickly recorded and released album after Smile was canceled, it still influenced. It was still original. It still had a unique sound and original sound, and it did ultimately influence people. It has.
In the chat, Brooks saying that Smiley Smile is used to treat people who've had a bad acid trip. That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I forgot about
I'm interested in learning more about that.
Honestly, me too. That's wild. But yeah, so as we said before, once Sergeant Pepper came out, Smile was eventually sort of given up on, and Smiley Smile came out. But I mean, Sergeant Pepper was. I'm still glad it came out. But Sergeant Pepper would have never happened without Pet Sounds, as we said. This is my favorite album.
How many copies of this do you own exactly?
Funny you ask. Let's count. No, I'm kidding. I have 10 copies on vinyl, and they're all all of them. Well, one of them is in the mono box up there, but the rest of them are here. And
which one sounds the best?
Which one sounds the best? It's a great question. I'd say to me, the best sounding one is the original UK mono.
Any specific reason? I'm just curious.
Well, to Sergeant Pepper mono mix. Well, the stereo mix is pretty good. I like. Well, I'll get to your question in a second. The stereo mix is good, but it was the mono mix that really had all the things that the Beatles wanted in terms of that album. They spent like 6 weeks mixing the mono mix and only like 3 days mixing the stereo mix. For example, The mono mix, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, is a bit slower. It has more flange, and like it's the double track vocal is really like rich and like
Cool. Okay.
flangy and everything. And they didn't do that for the stereo mix. All the things they wanted for the album were on the mono mix, but the stereo mix was sort of an afterthought. That's the best way to
Interesting.
describe
Okay.
it.
That's
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
As per the 50th anniversary remix, I love that. I mean, it takes all the things that they did with the mono mix and made a stereo version out of it. And they also, the way Sgt. Pepper was recorded, they recorded it on 4-track. They would record a track, they record it, and then bounce it down to another tape and record and bounce that, so on and so forth. The good thing is Sgt. Pepper, all those tapes were saved. So they were able to go back to all those tapes, sync them up and remix it. And they gave them all the same flares and quirks and intricate amazingness that they gave on the original mono mix. It's essentially a stereo version of the mono mix. I love it. I'm glad you agree, Josh. It's wonderful.
That's awesome.
All my British pressings are really good. The 2014 mono, the original stereo. I have a later pressing of the stereo, but it's like the same cutting. Even I have an Israeli copy. I used to live in Israel.
That's great.
And you know what's amazing about this? This copy uses the same cutting, like the same stamper, same cutting as the original British stereo mix. So
very cool.
It is very
cool.
Anyway, so Sgt. Pepper came out, and that's sort of what's canceled Smile. And as I had mentioned before, Paul McCartney was at the sessions for Vegetables, and I do actually have a little quote for a bit of research and a quote from Brian Wilson. After the Vegetable session, McCartney performed his song "She's Leaving Home" on piano for Wilson and his wife. And Brian Wilson said, "We both just cried. It was beautiful." Brian Wilson then performed "Wonderful" for McCartney on piano.
Wow.
And so I think
that's a good little trade-off.
It's a good trade-off. So, and I believe we will be starting our Pepper set with "She's Leaving Home."
Always stresses me out when to cut the end of that song.
As we said, this sort of creative rivalry kind of ended at this point, but make no mistake, the Beatles and the Beach Boys continue to influence each other and respect each other and be friends with each other. But of course, the Beatles did break up, and the Beach Boys have been together ever since. But even after that, there was still a continued mutual respect. So in 1968, the Beatles went to India, to Maharishi, and Mike Love from the Beach Boys was there. I might just start with another excerpt from Paul's book. Let me just read a little bit of that. When the Beach Boys released Pet Sounds in 1966, we could see once and for all that they were presenting us with some serious competition. Until then, they seemed like a pretty good surf band. They'd already produced some great stuff, some innovative work that had itself come out of the doo-wop tradition, and we'd already nicked a few of those little things. The harmonies would be a case in point. Of course, they were nicking from us. Everybody was nicking from everybody else. There was circularity to the whole enterprise. One way or another, the Russian protagonist of the song Back in the USSR has certainly been influenced by the Beach Boys, and Chuck Berry's Back in the USA is in there too. And it's perfectly in order for him to have been influenced by the Beach Boys. He's on a plane from Miami, after all, where he's been listening to California Girls in particular, which is why our bridge section refers to how the Ukraine Girls really knocked me out. There's a pretty blatant parody of a Beach Boys chorus in the background. End quote. That's from Paul McCartney's book. And so, like I said before, of course, as you saw in the photo, Mike Love was there at the Maharishi thing in India with the Beatles. And on a side fact, the Beach Boys' Friend Down, which none of the songs are on this call, but Mike was missing a lot from a lot of those sections because he was in India at the time. Anyway, Mike Love does recall McCartney. He recalled McCartney playing Back in the USSR for him in India over breakfast, and he was the one who apparently suggested to McCartney that the bridge section should focus on the girls in Russia. So
I did not know. That's very cool.
Right. So even though this sort of creative rivalry, like the Revolver, Pet Sounds, Sgt. Pepper's, even though that thing kind of ended, they never stopped. They never really stopped. In fact, the Beach Boys did another also did another cover of the Beatles. This one wasn't released until many, many years later, but they did a cover of Sgt. Pepper's with a little help from my friends. Oh, and by the way, back in USSR for a second. Ringo had briefly left the band for a few weeks during the sessions of White Album, so Paul McCartney plays drums on Back in USSR. But there is another song by the Beach Boys from the '80s called "California Calling." It's from the mid '80s. Guess who plays drums on that song? Ringo.
Not Paul. I thought it was going to be Paul again.
And Ringo plays on California Calling.
All right, well let's jump into this next block of songs, and then we got a little bit more for you right after that. But thanks for sticking around, and let us know if you have any last few questions here. Fuck my glove. All right, thanks for
Those are your
coming
three
to
words?
B-Sides, and that's my 3 words. Once again, I wanted to say thank you to Benjy, Benjy Schoenfeld. Thank you so much for putting together this playlist and for taking us through this era. It's been an absolute blast. The playlist can be found on the website immediately after this show, but Benjy has put together a hell of a playlist, and I couldn't thank you more, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I had the best time. There's nothing I enjoy more than listening to songs by my 2 favorite artists. I had a great time too.
Well, great, man. So I think you have one more pick for us that is going to take us out for the night. So would you mind explaining what that is for us?
Yeah, sure. There is a song Brian Wilson. So before Brian Wilson finally released his take on Smile in 2004, he put out an album that same year, right before it, called Getting In Over My Head, and it features a whole bunch of collaborations with other famous musicians. There's one song on that album called "A Friend Like You." It was written by Brian and a guy called Steve Kalinich, who did write some songs with the Beach Boys. He wrote "Little Bird" and some other songs from the '60s with the Beach Boys, but he did write this song with Brian. It's called "A Friend Like You," and the co-lead singer on the album is Paul McCartney. On that song is Paul McCartney himself. And like I said, yes, they had a bit of a creative rivalry, but they all like and respect each other. And heck, without them, we wouldn't have any of this music. And this music is so amazing. And I'm just so grateful that Paul and Brian are good friends and collaborators, and 2 of the greatest songwriters of all time. And I don't know where we'd be. God only knows where we'd be without them.
Perfectly put, man. All right, so let's end on "A Friend Like You." But thanks again, everybody, for joining, and thank you, Benjy, for putting this together. Really appreciate it, man. Have a good one.